In 20, 30, and 100 years, what 5 states are predicted to be the safest and best to get away from major climate change? And what 5 states are predicted to be the riskiest on the climate index? These states will be ranked based on 5 main categories: extreme heat, drought, wildfires, inland flooding, and coastal flooding. I'll be covering that and more in this video, so stick around. For the record, these are not my own statistics or even necessarily my own views of what will happen, but those of safehome.org, whose link can be found in the description. I'm much more optimistic than these scientists are, but I admit that I am no expert. I should also mention that Hawaii and Alaska weren't included in the study as they were much less comparable to the other states in many aspects. What I think will make this more interesting for you is if you guess ahead of time what 2 of the best states are and what 2 of the worst states are for expected climate change. Starting with number 5, Colorado has been ranked among the top places to avoid heavy climate change risks. On the risk index, it's been giving a 106 rating, with the safest state being a 30 and the highest risk state being a 308 on the charts. While Colorado isn't expected to experience major floods as a result of climate change, it is expected that Colorado could experience extreme heat, which all of the states actually are expected to get, so that's not unusual. Droughts and wildfires are also predicted to become more common in Colorado's future. Droughts are expected to become more prevalent in 75% of states, and wildfires are expected to be more common in 52% of states. The average day is expected to have 49 dangerously hot days in 2050, which are days with a heat index of at least 105 degrees. In comparison, Colorado is only expected to have 13 days of extreme heat. Colorado is predicted to be at a 200% larger risk of droughts than it currently is, and 30% of the population will be living in elevated wildfire risk areas. This all sounds really bad, but all the predictions are pretty doom and gloomy all the way around. Colorado is at least expected to do a lot better than the southern states and has already seen quite a few people moving over there in recent times. Number 4 on the list of least risky states for climate change in the future is Minnesota, which is ranked just barely above Colorado with a 104 on the risk index. Minnesota is a bit farther north than Colorado, and unlike that state, its population isn't expected to be at an increased wildfire risk. There are only expected to be about 6 days of dangerous heat in 2050 here, and the state is expected to have a 140% increase in droughts by 2050. One of the downsides this study also points out is that with increased heat, longer summers, etc., some states will experience longer mosquito season days, and unfortunately, Minnesota is expected to have around 34 days more mosquito season in 2050. For reference, it currently goes from about May to October. Moving on to number 3, Massachusetts is a 99 on the risk index, so the top 3 are the only ones below a 100 on the risk index. This state is expected to have around 16 days of extreme heat, but isn't expected to have either increased risk of wildfires or droughts. Instead, it is expected to be at an increased risk of coastal and inland flooding. The climate scientists are expecting only 1.2% of the Massachusetts population to be affected by coastal flooding. So that's not much of the state, but it is still currently around 84,000 people that would be affected. The study doesn't mention how much of the state is expected to be at a risk of increased inland flooding, so my guess is the number is below 1%. Massachusetts is expected to do quite well overall, but there is an expected growth in the mosquito season by about 23 days. Number 2, New Hampshire comes in at a 63 on the climate change risk index, which is well below the other 3 already mentioned, and super below the rest of the 48 states in the study. New Hampshire is just north of Massachusetts and has a small portion of oceanfront land, and 0.4% of the population is expected to be at a risk of coastal flooding in 2050. Along with that, New Hampshire is expected to have 9 days of dangerous heat and 15 more days of mosquito season. I would say this state is expected to be doing pretty well in the next 30 to 50 years, and much better than most other states are predicted. Coming in at number 1 at a whopping 30 on the climate index, you might have guessed it, but my hometown state of Vermont takes the cake. Vermont is expected to be doing extremely well in the next 30 to 50 years compared to the rest of the 48 states in this study. It happens to be the only state that will experience only one of the 5 increased risk factors on the study that I mentioned earlier, and that happens to be extreme heat days, and there's expected to be only 9 of them. Same as New Hampshire. And with that, there is expected to be about 13 more days of mosquito season. Vermont really comes in quite close to New Hampshire with those things, but the coastal flooding in New Hampshire really pushed it above Vermont a ways. I've done some additional research, and Lamoille County in Vermont is expected to be literally the best county in the whole United States for staying safe from climate change. Many of you have likely heard of the popular tourist town of Stowe, Vermont before, and that is in this county. It is a very expensive place to live, but the surrounding towns in the county, Morristown, Johnson, Eden, Cambridge, are all quite a bit less expensive than Stowe and are still in Lamoille County. Believe it or not, but I'm actually a real estate agent and I cover the whole state of Vermont and would be more than happy to help you move here if that's what you decide to do. I've actually had quite a few people tell me they're moving to escape super hot and dry states around the country, and they see Vermont has the best rankings for climate change. I'm not trying to scare people into moving here, but I am here to show you just another reason why you should consider moving to beautiful Vermont. I can also recommend great agents in other states if you need one to sell your current home or to help you buy your next one. Let's get on to the scary predictions for the top 5 states expected to be the worst affected by climate change. Number 5, Mississippi ranks on the risk index with a rating of 270. By 2050, Mississippi is expected to have around 111 dangerously hot days. Mississippi is already quite hot, but it's expected to keep getting hotter. It's expected to have 21 more days of high wildfire risk, with over half the population at risk, a 140% increase in summer droughts, and 2.5% of the population at risk of coastal flooding. Next on the list for most at-risk states for climate change is North Carolina, ranking 276 on the risk index. North Carolina is predicted to be at risk for all 5 of the climate change risk factors. It's expected to have 70 dangerously hot days, 7 more high-risk wildfire days, a 50% increase in droughts, with 4.4% of the population at an elevated risk for inland flooding, and 1.2% of the population is expected to experience coastal flooding. There's also expected to be about 33 more days of mosquito season. Louisiana hits third on the most affected by climate change with a 281 on the risk index, and is expected to experience all of the risk factors except for increased inland flooding. Louisiana is predicted to have 120 days of dangerous heat, which is basically a third of the year, with a 120% increase in droughts, 23 high wildfire risk days, with a total of 20% of the population affected by coastal flooding. Hopefully these scientists aren't successful in their predictions. South Carolina comes in at number 2, ranking 1 point above Louisiana at 282, and is at risk for 4 of the 5 factors. It's not expected to have a higher rate of droughts in 2050, which is at least a plus. 4.2% of the population is expected to be at risk for inland flooding, and 4.6% is expected to experience coastal flooding. So it sounds like South Carolina is more likely to have the problem of too much water, just maybe not as much rain. There are 12 more days of high wildfire risk days predicted, and 90 dangerous heat days, with 57% of the population at risk of wildfires. As I think many of you might have guessed, Florida is high up, coming in at number 1 on the list with a 308 on the risk index. While a lot of Vermonters leave in the wintertime to be somewhere warmer, people in these southern states like Florida are going to want to start spending their really hot summers somewhere farther north like Vermont. I've actually worked with a few people looking for a summer home for this very reason. Florida is expected to have 150 dangerously hot days in 2050, and I think even now a lot of people are feeling the heat more than ever. 7.1% of the population is at an increased risk for inland flooding, and 16.7% of the population is expected to suffer from increased coastal flooding by 2050. There's expected to be a 120% increase in drought likelihood, and 18 more high-risk wildfire days in the state. As you all can see, these outcomes look pretty bad for the country overall. These predictions are only 28 years out, and I personally feel pretty doubtful that there will be these major changes in such a short time period. Again, I am no expert, so do your own research. People in Florida and on the West Coast have told me they do feel it's been hotter than ever in recent years, but 28 years seems pretty rushed for all that to happen. The hottest temperature ever recorded in the US was in California's Death Valley, 134 degrees in 1913. Now, in July of 2021, it did reach 131 degrees there, but that's not even reaching the peak, which was recorded over a century ago. Florida, which is number 1 on this list, had an all-time high temperature of 109 degrees back in 1931. That was about 90 years ago, and we still haven't beaten that record, so these scientists must have more information than I do, because I don't yet see the threat of global warming to be coming as fast as they are saying. In the description, you can see a list of every state's record high temperatures, and currently only 6 of the 50 states have had record high numbers after the year 2000, and many of the other record days were way before 2000. This summer of 2022 was the third hottest summer in 128 years, so I will admit that, and that's probably why more people are feeling it now more than ever. But ultimately, we will have to wait and see what the future brings. I am certainly blessed to live in a state with a pretty great climate, minus some of the freezing cold time in the winter, and I love helping people who want to move from a much hotter state to Vermont. Whether or not the temperature is getting much hotter in places like Florida, it's pretty hot and dry as it is, and Vermont is a great place to escape that. We aren't expected to have increased fires or droughts, so worst case scenario, you are making a pretty safe bet on the state of Vermont. And if you have the ability to work from home, why not live in the best rated state for climate change, as well as one of the top 3 lowest crime rated states, and one with some of the best views and landscapes in the whole US. If that's something you want to do, call, text, email me, or reach out with the Google form in the description, and I would be more than happy to help you find your next home. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment.